or anything else you would like to
no, certainly. I think the theme that I was given was regional disparities and urbanization from a Sri Lankan perspective. So I said a little bit
quite
about
illuminating if you do that.
Regional disparities, and then say something on urbanization. Well, in terms of regional disparities from a Sri Lankan perspective, I'd first like to talk about the social indicators and social development, and then the growth story, and then say a little bit about urbanization. Now, if you look at Sri Lanka, if you look at the PQLI index in the 70s, the Human Development Index, the MDGs, Sri Lanka has been an outperformer. It's punched well above its weight. If you now currently look at the headcount poverty rate, it's 8.9%. In PPP terms, I saw in the paper it's low at 4.1%. The unemployment rate is less than 5%. So these are extremely impressive numbers. And certainly those are numbers for which the country can take credit. But if you drill down a little bit further, there is no cause for complacency. I say that for two reasons. There are lagging regions, particularly in terms of social development, particularly the conflict-affected areas. And there's clearly a good reason for that. So that is still a work in progress in terms of getting these regions back up to speed. And the other large pocket that is lagging is the estate sector. This is a perennial problem that's been there now for several decades. In fact, one could argue that this has been a classical case of internal colonialism in this country. Some progress has been made, but that sector continues to lag in terms of the social indicators. So those are the three big pockets. But there are also pockets of poverty in both the rural and urban areas in other parts of the country which are better provided. But by and large, one could say that Sri Lanka, in terms of provision of basic services, it has been pretty spatially blind. It has been able to deliver basic services across the country well for a country at this stage of development. But as I said, there are some gaps. But more than that, going forward, one needs to ask whether the model that has delivered these positive outcomes in terms of social development is sustainable. And the case I'd like to make is that it will not be sustainable now that Sri Lanka has become a lower middle income country without an accelerated trajectory of growth. That more growth will give more fiscal space to be able to sustain the gains that have been acquired so far. Now, why do I say that? If you look at how Sri Lanka's social development has been driven, it's been driven far less by economic transformation when one compares the Sri Lankan experience with, say, East and Southeast Asia. The achievements have been driven far less by economic transformation and more by external inflows. Sri Lanka has been a donor darling for many years, and 5–6% of GDP came as ODA, much of it IDA and ADF money, never money. And this helped Sri Lanka to basically live beyond its means, to have this spatially blind provision of basic services across the country without perhaps generating the domestic resource mobilization that would normally be necessary to sustain this. But suddenly you have this graduation to low middle income country status, ineligibility for this 5% of GDP, never money, and now recourse to commercial borrowing, exposure to rating agencies, much tougher discipline in terms of fiscal performance, which has historically been extremely poor, as it has been in other parts of South Asia. So there is a new paradigm that the country is in. And really, I would say that without growth, without accelerated growth, it is going to be difficult for Sri Lanka to protect the gains it has had in terms of social development and to build upon them. Now, let me say a little bit about urbanization. Sri Lanka seems, on the face of it, to be a bit of a paradox. Because the official numbers say that Sri Lanka, there's 15% of the population lives in urban areas. Of course, being a small country with a pretty good communications network, and with the road development that is going on at the moment, distances have shrunk even more. Nobody lives very far away from an urban center. However, we have been able to keep people out in the rural areas through the current model, which has been based heavily on subsidies and transfers. So you have a situation where agriculture accounts for about 32% of the workforce, but delivers 11% of the GDP. So productivity in agriculture is a third of what it is in the rest of the economy, and the whole economy has productivity of less than half of Thailand. So you can see if this kind of large well of low productivity, sucking in human and financial resources, because it is a heavily subsidized sector, and giving such low returns.
1 minute more.
Yeah, such low returns means that clearly it is not possible to sustain the kinds of growth rate that is necessary to protect the gains that we've had in the past. So there has to be a shift of resources, both human and financial, to higher productivity sectors. And really that is the challenge for Sri Lanka, to move from a low productivity agriculture, low technology manufacturing, traditional services, retail, wholesale trade, and public service, to higher productivity agriculture, higher tech manufacturing, and modern services, shipping, aviation, etc. So really that transformation is what is necessary, and how that has to be done is really the challenge for the country.
Would you like to spend 10 seconds on urbanization?
Sure. As I said, urbanization really, for Sri Lanka, it's been, on the face of it, very low. If you look at the World Development Report of 2010, I think it was, it argued that economic density and economies of agglomeration were necessary in a globalized economy. And therefore, that disparities were in fact inevitable if one wanted to have an accelerated growth trajectory. The challenge is to build up economic density in certain urban centers which would be globally competitive, at the same time provide spatially blind, provide basic services on a spatially blind basis, so that the whole country has education, health, sanitation, etc., but that you have really these centers that you build up in terms of economic density, which provide a competitive capacity within the economy, and you have mobility of people within the country with connectivity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think everybody got that message very clear, that first is to be sustainable, one needs to get the growth rate going. I think two other issues which have come out is that even when a country which has done specially blind public service provisioning, still you have 2-3 pockets where targeted intervention will still be necessary. But nonetheless, specially blind process has to go on, provided you create more fiscal space for it, for underwriting them. And then final point is, how do you build competitive urban agglomerates in that particular way. This whole discussion about urbanization sometimes seems to be that all urban citizens are as if equal. We have read that even in small urban cities, there is always a city of the rich and a city of the poor. It is not that it is always the city which is shared by everybody in the right way. So the access to public services is very critical in this particular way, definitely. But I'm coming to the end of my panel. And I have saved the minister to the end, because he is the man on the driving seat at this moment, both as a legislator and also as a policy implementer. And you have seen all the suggestions which have come through from our eminent panelist and the keynote speaker. All concerns one form or the other public intervention, the role of the state. Even managing the market, creating policies for that, or for a much more balanced and equitable globalization, would again need some kind of rule-making role of the state in many ways. Now, Harold Lasky told us that when the country is owned by few rich and large number of poor, at the end of the day, it will be managed by the rich people, not the poor. And if you look at Waqar's this game changers model on individual empowerment, it was very interesting, very conspicuously, trade unions were absent there. So you had media, youth, and all other civil society, but trade union was not there as a single entity, or agrarian cooperatives were also not there in that way. Although Professor Sobhan is asking for distributive justice, where this kind of power agents are supposed to act. Now, my point to the minister is that how do we deal with this without restructuring the state in many ways and restructuring the politics as it is being practiced in our part of the world? Mr. Minister.
Thank you very much. I think the fundamental challenge is in the coupling of politics and economy. In politics, we all make speeches about the poor. We all speak about them. Economists write volumes of books and publish many papers on how is the poverty growing and inequality growing, but yet nothing happens. So I think it is that coupling which is missing, the political economy. And here, the two very promising signs are that the role of civil society and media is growing. And I think if we can somehow channelize this new force in setting the agenda of political economy, that can break the status quo. Let me give you some examples. How this new force has brought about, and I referred to in my paper also yesterday, in Nepal against monarchy. It was not the work of traditional political forces, but the new civil society and media which provided the kind of fuel it needed. In Pakistan, the movement for restoration of judges, it was unprecedented. And again, the fuel came to this movement from media, civil society, the lawyers, and of course, the political forces were also with it. Then the movement for transparency against corruption, Ana Hazare movement in India we saw. And very recently, again we see that how, cases in India for some female journalists, they rallied the civil society and media where state had to respond. And now that has gone to the center stage, the whole theme of women harassment. So media and civil society, I think, offer us a great opportunity. And if think tanks and academicians can also fall in line and can use this platform, we can break the status quo. I would also like to say that the society is changing in many respects. I was just listening to the debate on urbanization. How do we define urban centers? Traditionally, urban centers were defined by certain criteria of population or density of population or density of economic activity. But again now media and mobility is changing the whole scope of urbanization. For example, when in '93 I started my political career and I was campaigning, mine is a very predominantly a rural constituency. So when I went to a village for votes and when I went to city, I could see how I was hosted. In city, I was given Pepsi Cola or Coke. But when I went to a village, I was given lassi, the yogurt milk. Then, 5, 7, 8 years later, I saw that lassi in the villages got replaced with tea. And 10 years ago, it was considered very insulting for any farming community to offer tea because it thought that they have no cattle and they have no milk of their own. But then the economic pressures compelled everyone to sell or dispose the extra milk they had into the market, so everyone came to tea. But now, when I go to villages, I am hosted the same way people host me in the cities. Immediately they would bring a bottle of mineral water. Immediately they will fetch a bottle of Coke and Pepsi. They will also bring a box of tissues. And anything what you want in cities is available in the rural areas. So this whole lifestyle and the consumption pattern in the rural areas also is changing, and I think it would be very erroneous for us to see villages or the rural areas as a stricto sensu rural area as it used to be. So it is also beginning to show many characteristics of urban life in terms of its lifestyle and its consumption patterns. And I think that also creates some opportunities in the rural areas, which Vaqar was also referring, that how do we treat the rural area. So with this new urbanization in the rural areas or sectors offers maybe opportunities for some rural enterprise. And through that rural enterprise, we can create local opportunities for people. My main concern is, and I will share with you some case studies which we have tried and have done well, and that is the biggest obstacle in inclusive growth to me is the education system. If we are entering a knowledge era where brain power is going to be more defining than the muscle power, then what is the quality of education we are giving to underprivileged, poor, or those who are marginalized? That is going to be the key driver of deciding which way we are heading. So therefore, the whole education debate needs to move beyond literacy numbers. And we need to also examine what is the content, what are we giving, what is the quality of education. Let me just share quickly 2-3 examples. In Punjab province, where we had our government, there were 2-3 initiatives which were targeted on along these lines, and they had very good results. For example, in terms of building up the public sector system, we recruited 80,000 teachers purely on merit in a very transparent manner. Their lists were displayed and there were complaint centers. Anybody could complain if anyone was selected out of merit. So what they did was, within 3 years, the average score of public sector schools in class 5 examination was little higher than the average score of the private schools. So that showed a very strong correlation between quality of teachers and the output. And these public sector schools are catering to the poor segment. So reforming the public sector education system holds key to how we will deal with inclusive debate or inequality debate. Number 2, we established 4,500 computer laboratories in all the high schools. Now, why was this important? That digital divide is going to be a major bottleneck because we have moved from pen literacy to computer literacy age. So how our society is going to respond to computer or digital divide in their societies will also determine. Number 3, we also set up a Punjab Education Endowment Fund where every year government was putting in 2 billion rupees. And at the end of the 5 years, there's a 10 billion rupee fund which is giving out 40,000 scholarships to the poorest of the poor on merit. When board exams are held, students from the public sector schools and colleges, they are automatically selected for those scholarships, to pursue higher education in whichever field and whichever educational institution they want to pursue. So I think creating such vertical social mobility ladders is also very critical so that we can create the kind of enterprise within our society which will take this thing forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. I think all of you would agree with the Minister that education remains one of the key vehicles for the social and economic transformation. And as you know, the development community is all discussing the post-2015 development goals. And all the surveys which has gone around the world, done by the UN and by the others, education turned out to be the #1 desired goal in all the surveys across income groups, sex, and also income level in countries of various development level. And the point which everybody is making, not in education per se, which the Minister said, it is the quality education which more matters than the education per se. So the quality of the education remains over there. But what I didn't hear from the Minister is that how politics is going to change that. I heard everything other than politics.
I think politics also changes with the changes in society. I mean, as you know that I was mentioning in the opening remarks that the civil society and media offer the greatest opportunity to change politics. How is the debate going to be set up by
I thought it was
two?
the other way around.
No, I think the politics responds to what happens in societies, mainly, unless that there is a very visionary politics which transforms the society. But in absence of an outstanding visionary transformational
Are you telling
nature
us
of
there is no
politics,
visionary politics now in South Asia?
I think so. I mean, you know, in many respects, it is visible in some areas. For example, where we are sitting in Sri Lanka, they have shown a vision to tackle with their civil war. They have found their own indigenous model. A conflict which was going on for last 30 years, finally they found a solution. So they showed us the way that local problems cannot be solved by a foreign solution. You have to have local solutions for local problems.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I will request all of you now to jointly give a hand of applause to all my panelists over here. What they said, but because they have kept within the time. And that was also a big challenge for us, so that I do not increase the disparity in time allocation between the panel and the floor. The floor is going to be open now. Please refrain from giving mini speeches, and make your points straight away, as blunt as possible, so that we can make the afternoon interesting. Maxim speeches. Yes, please. Rajiv, would you kindly, for the record, say your affiliation?
Rajiv Kumar, Senior Fellow, Center for Policy Research, Delhi. Great paper and wonderful discussion. I just thought, I've heard somewhere that it's very good to always keep things simple, make it simple. And I think in South Asia, we do very often the opposite. We make things very complicated. And I start off by saying that, for example, even in this session, we are not keeping it simple. We are mixing up poverty reduction with inequality. So let's be clear, what do we want? What is our objective in this region? We continuously mix it up. And therefore, in that respect, nobody ever criticizes China and its performance for the last 3 decades. Inequality has increased in China, much more than in South Asia. But their success has been that poor people have completely come down. And their reduction in poverty is huge. So I think that's the first message I want to give, that why don't we focus on poverty reduction rather than continuously talk about inequality, which is going to be quite counterproductive and only becoming conflictual rather than convergence. So that's the first point. 2 other points, Mr. Chairman. Second one is that in keeping it simple, I cannot see anybody denying the importance of growth, rapid growth. We always add the words inclusive, sustainable, pro-regional. Growth here, 8%, 9%, 10%, you keep it for 3 decades, you got it. First, in economics, we always call the distinction between necessary condition and sufficient condition. Growth is the necessary condition. Let's get that first, keep it simple. That's the second thing that I wanted to say. And the third, and this is what I found quite amazing, disappointing in this no light, only heat debate between Sen and Bhagwati, nobody talks about combining growth with good governance. You mentioned it yourself. If you achieve good governance, you won't get unequal working of the market forces. I mean, if the government is doing its job, instead we find in this country, in our region, very often saying, Guru Sharan saying, growth takes place when government is sleeping. Nonsense. Cannot happen. So the point is that you got to get the poverty reduction through the good governance. So these are the 3 things that I thought maybe I'll put it before the panel and would like to see them respond.
I think the 3 very sharp points. I think people may agree but may not agree, but the issues are very, very pertinent, no doubt about that. I will take one from the back and then I will come back in the front. Please, at the end.
Thank you very much for allowing me to have the floor. I didn't see any addressal. There was a lot of talk about game changers and breakthroughs.
Excuse me, I know you, but would you introduce yourself, because many people are not being...
My name is Daniel Aziz. I'm a member of Parliament from Pakistan and representing Genie Governance Institutes Network International.
Thank you.
I just wanted to know if there was anybody from the panel who would like to comment on the potential future role of extractive industries providing a breakthrough, because the kind of information which is now coming out with regard to deposits in Afghanistan and Pakistan and other places, especially where technological revolution of shale gas and other extractive industries for gold, copper, aluminum, lithium, etc., are coming forward. If the world is any bit of an example, these extractive industries developed tend to have a game-changing effect on domestic economy. So if anybody would like to comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you. That's a question on resource curse. Okay, once I get the floor completed, I will invite the panelists to respond to those. Dr. Jagdish from Bangladesh.
Thank you. Jagdish from the Policy Research Institute. First of all, my compliments to the panel, and particularly to Vaqar for his presentation, for a very comprehensive paper on the subject, which, honestly speaking, I had no clue about before I got onto the plane and started reading your paper very thoroughly. I think, the title is a bit misleading because, I couldn't figure out what they were talking about, inter-country growth disparities. Well, I know there's a lot of disparity in Bangladesh. East-west divide, there's leading regions and lagging regions and rural-urban divide. But we don't know what the growth disparities are. There are income disparities, there are consumption disparities and all that. So maybe in India, you know what the growth disparities between states are. And maybe, I don't know if Pakistan has similar statistics. But it was very difficult for me from Bangladesh to figure out what growth disparities were. So I think the title is a bit misleading. Now let me get to my comment, which takes into account Waqar's 4 provocative questions, and it's question number 2 that I'd like to comment on. And this is the structural transformation you talked about, rural development. Here again, I think we have a tendency to look at what happened in South Asia through our eyes. I look at South Asia sometimes through Bangladeshi eyes. You do it perhaps through Pakistani eyes, and our Indian colleagues would do it from Indian eyes. And I notice statements like, South Asia growth has been driven by services. And I don't think that is the case in Bangladesh. It might be the case in India, where the service sector has indeed risen to be something like 60% plus. And so that is sort of a departure from the structural, the stylized facts of structural transformation for developing countries. Bangladesh pretty much is following the stylized facts, where the size of agriculture is declining, size of industry in which manufacturing dominates is rising. And so it's pretty much the standard structural transformation. So services is not necessarily becoming the dominant sector in Bangladesh, unlike what we see in the developed countries. Yes, they have gone into that sort of transformation. The services sector makes up 60 to 70% of their GDP, but not necessarily in other countries in South Asia. So that is important to recognize, for the reason that there is a question of falling into the middle income trap if you're leapfrogging from agriculture to services.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes. Ambassador, come on.
My name is Madhu Acharya. I don't know if this is the right plenary to ask, but I was hoping to hear something regarding the external shocks and vulnerabilities. Vaqar, you mentioned the game changers, etc., but nobody's talking about the current the currency crisis, the free fall of rupees, and how that's going to change the game. I was reading Paul Krugman, who says this is exactly like 1997 crisis in East Asia, and it's going to replicate in South Asia. Is that still a relevant point to discuss, or I don't know?